Hey everyone, Father Lane here. Welcome to another class in our course on the Pauline letters. You can see it is a beautiful day here in Cleveland, Ohio, home of Progressive Field, where the Indians play. It's appropriate that we discuss 2 Corinthians here in Cleveland, because just as a lot of people don't think of Cleveland when they think of great sports towns, although they should, 2 Corinthians, when I first started studying the Pauline letters, didn't strike me as much of a treasure. It struck me as a difficult to read and kind of boring letter. Then I started teaching years ago, and I realized what a treasure 2 Corinthians is. How it really is, to borrow a quote from Paul's words in the letter, it is a treasure hidden within an earthen vessel. Its structure might be a little difficult. It may change topics a lot, but there are some really beautiful ideas contained in this letter. In today's class, we're going to look at a few of the background details of this letter, and then in our next class, we'll get into more of the theology of 2 Corinthians. First, we're going to look at what happened between 1st and 2 Corinthians. Some time elapses between these two canonical letters, and there's a whole backstory that helps us to understand what's going on in 2 Corinthians. We're then going to deal with a difficult diachronic question. Was what we currently have as 2 Corinthians originally one letter? Is it a united letter? Does it have unity? Also, might there be an interpolation? Might something have been added to it? So the question of, does this letter have unity and integrity? We're going to discuss that question. And then we'll do a synchronic survey. We'll look at an outline of our current 2 Corinthians. So let's talk first at what happened after Paul sent 1 Corinthians. You'll recall from our discussion on 1 Corinthians that canonical 1 Corinthians, the letter that we have in our Bible that we call 1 Corinthians, was actually at least the second piece of correspondence that Paul had sent to the Corinthian church. We know because Paul had said in 1 Corinthians, he had referred to a letter that he had already written, which we called letter A. 1 Corinthians, our current canonical 1 Corinthians, is letter B. Paul had sent 1 Corinthians, and he had intended to go and visit the Corinthian Christians again soon. We're going to find out, however, that Paul's plans changed. Paul tells us here in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, "With this confidence I formerly intended to come to you so that you might receive a double favor, namely to go by way of you to Macedonia, and then to come to you again on my return from Macedonia." So Paul had intended to go to Corinth twice. However, he tells us just later in the chapter, "I call upon God as witness on my life, that it is to spare you that I have not yet gone to Corinth. For I decided not to come to you again in painful circumstances." Now this raises a question. We can clearly conclude that at least one of those two visits that Paul had planned, he had to cancel. But why did he have to cancel it? And is it possible that he canceled both visits? Most scholars, and there's plenty of dispute on this, most scholars believe that Paul made one of those two visits. So Paul had visited Corinth once when he founded the Corinthian church. That's the visit that's mentioned in Acts chapter 18, and that was during the second missionary journey. Then on the third missionary journey, he seems to have gone a second time because it says here, "I decided not to come to you again in painful circumstances." Painful circumstances would seemingly poorly describe Paul's initial visit. So we think that he made one of these two visits, but not the second. Indeed, we know that Paul is going to come to Corinth again after he sends 2 Corinthians. He tells us in chapter 13, "This third time I am coming to you." So we know that there are 3 trips to Corinth. The founding visit, this one visit that we usually call the painful visit, and then a third time after 2 Corinthians is sent. So given this history that we've reconstructed, we can now draw a few more conclusions. Paul is going to go to Corinth after 1 Corinthians on his third missionary journey. That's going to be that painful visit. The visit goes poorly, and in chapter 2, verse 4, he tells us that he sends a letter, quote, "with many tears." Scholars call this third piece of correspondence, which, like the first one, we no longer have a copy of, we call that letter C. However, we're going to learn in 2 Corinthians that Paul sends Titus, who later reports that the Corinthians have repented, that they're reconciling, to use the key word in 2 Corinthians, with Paul. Canonical 2 Corinthians is letter D. It's the fourth piece of correspondence. But scholars don't stop there. As if that were not complicated enough, a number of scholars argue that not all of 2 Corinthians was written at one time. that there was this letter D, the letter of reconciliation, and then what currently comes to us as the latter part of 2 Corinthians is part of a separate polemical letter, which they call letter E. And that gets us to our second topic of the day, unity and integrity. You'll remember we talked about this earlier in the course. Unity is the technical term scholars give to the question of whether an entire letter was written at one time by St. Paul. Integrity, by contrast, refers to the question of whether an authentic letter is free of interpolations, of things that have been added later. Both of these questions arise in the case of 2 Corinthians. A number of scholars dispute the unity. Everyone agrees that Paul wrote 2 Corinthians. That's not the question. Everyone agrees that the historical St. Paul wrote 2 Corinthians. The question, though, is did he do it at one time? Scholars look at the following two passages and ask questions. On the one hand, Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 7, and his, that is Titus's heart, goes out to you all the more as he remembers the obedience of all of you when you received him with fear and trembling. Notice what that says. The obedience of all of you. And Paul is confident. 3 chapters later, that confidence is gone. Paul says, we destroy arguments and every pretension raising itself against the knowledge of God, and take every thought captive in obedience to Christ, and we are ready to punish every disobedience once your obedience is complete. A number of scholars, and I join them, believe that chapters 10 through 13 were this separate polemical letter that had a different focus than the first 9 chapters, which we can think of as the letter of reconciliation. A number of scholars think it's all one letter. Still other scholars think that 2 Corinthians was originally 3 letters. At least one scholar thinks it was originally 6 letters. I think that's a little too enthusiastic, but I would suggest to you that it's easy to understand how these 2 letters would have been fused together. We read in 1 Clement, this is an early patristic writing from the very end of the 1st century, where the 4th Pope, Pope St. Clement I, says, "Take up the epistle of the blessed Apostle Paul. What did he write to you at the time when the gospel first began to be preached? Truly, under the inspiration of the Spirit, he wrote to you concerning himself and Cephas and Apollos, because even then parties had been formed among you." Notice the language here. It does say under the inspiration of the Spirit, which does tell us that the doctrine of inspiration of Scripture, including the New Testament, is ancient. But besides that, it says, take up the epistle, singular. It seems as though Clement only knows of one letter written to the Corinthians. So it's possible that only canonical 1 Corinthians had circulated by this time. Perhaps after Clement had sent this letter, other correspondence was gathered together and then circulated as one big piece, which we now call 2 Corinthians. We'll ultimately never be able to prove any of that, but we should point out that the earliest textual external evidence to 2 Corinthians as a distinct letter comes from the mid-2nd century, so it's certainly possible. So many scholars hold, and I join them, that 2 Corinthians was originally 2 letters, letter D, the letter of reconciliation, and letter E, the polemical letter. Letter D is the first 9 chapters, letter E, the last 4 chapters. This brings us to our synchronic survey. We can talk first about the epistolary elements. Unless there are interpolations, and some scholars say the end of chapter 6 and the beginning of chapter 7 is an interpolation. The senders are Paul and Timothy. We know that this is to the Corinthian church as well as all other Christians who are living throughout Achaia. We don't know how many of those there would have been, but that's what the superscription says. The occasion, again, we've already talked about this, that further trouble succeeded 1 Corinthians. And so after there had been some rough weather between Paul and the Corinthian church, Paul reconciles with the Corinthian Christians and seeks to cement that reconciliation in letter D. Apparently also there's going to be some false preachers, the so-called super apostles, to use Paul's word for them. They're going to be the topic of the polemical letter that is letter E, or on the alternative, if the letter was all written at once, the last 4 chapters of 2 Corinthians. The first 9 chapters are about Paul restoring a relationship with the Corinthian Christians, achieving a reconciliation that will give Paul a new metaphor for what Christ does for believers. He also urges the Corinthians to participate in his collection for the Jerusalem church. That's chapters 8 and 9. Chapters 10 through 13 are polemical against Paul's enemies, which he calls the super apostles. Paul is going to use judicial rhetoric to defend his apostleship. We're going to explore this in greater detail in our next class. Until then, read well and pray well.